Hey everyone, this is Robin from Designhill, your host for the day. I hope you and your family are keeping well and safe. I would like to welcome you in this session where we are discussing Intro to Branding from definitions to design. Today's event is brought to you by Designhill, world's leading creative marketplace that caters to the creative needs of businesses and individuals alike who can source high quality designs from professional designers and buy unique products created by independent artists. So, moving ahead, guys, let me introduce our guest for today. We have with us Rob Meyerson. Rob Meyerson is principal and founder of Heirloom, an independent brand strategy and identity firm. His specialties include brand strategy and positioning, naming and messaging, brand architecture, qualitative research, and organizational change. He is also creator and host of How Brands Are Built, the podcast where branding professionals get into the details of what they do and how they do it, and the associated blog and resource platform. Prior to Heirloom, Rob's previous roles included head of brand architecture and naming at HP, director of verbal identity at Interbrand in San Francisco, and director of strategy at Future Brand in Southeast Asia. His client experiences ranges from Fortune 500 to Silicon Valley startups and from San Francisco to Shanghai, including brands such as Flex, GE, JD Power, Disney, John Deere, and Intel. Rob has published articles about brand strategy and naming in Branding Strategy Insider, Business Insider, Guardian, TechCrunch, and VentureBeat, among others. So, Rob, can you please say a quick hi to the audience? Rob, you are on mute.
Hi, everybody. I see lots of people joining and signing in over on the right side there. I can't respond to each of you individually, but I'm glad you're all here and welcome. I'm excited to get started.
Great. And Rob, we would also like to thank you today for joining us here today for the event. And guys, here is a quick update. You can take the screenshot of this event and tweet it. Use Design Hill events, tag Design Hill DH and Rob Meyerson, whose Twitter handle is in the chat. And one lucky winner will have a chance to win a PS gift card worth $50. We will also be providing certificates to the event attendees, so make sure you stay with us till the end. Along with that, as a gesture of appreciation that you could join us for this event, we'll be sharing some special offers for you. Keep an eye on our chat section to get the same. All right, so before we start the session, let's quickly look at what Design Hill is all about. I think there's some technical issue from the back end, so we were not able to play the ad. Okay, no problem. So we can continue with the session, Rob, and over to you. You can share your PDF and let's start the session now.
Great. Give me 1 second to get this up and running. Okay. So thank you all for joining me. We have a lot of content to get through, so I am going to move pretty quickly. But why are we here? So the objectives of the day are to understand concepts, strategies, tactics that brand strategists use to build strong and valuable brands. And generally speaking, I'll mention this a few times, but I've taught this class before, not with Designhill, but I used to teach it in person back when we could all meet in person more regularly. And I found that there were 3 reasons that people used to take this class. So hopefully some of these match the reasons that you're here today. So you may have a brand that you're building yourself, whether it's a company that you work for, an entrepreneurial enterprise, maybe it's your own brand, or just a project, a side project, and you're trying to strengthen that brand. So hopefully you'll learn some things here that'll help you do that today. It may be that you work for a larger organization, you're on the brand team, or maybe you work for an agency and you're trying to figure out how to help your clients have stronger brands. Or it may just be sort of general interest. You don't work in the branding profession, but you'd like to, or you're trying to move up in your career and you think the more you learn about brand strategy, the more easily you'll be able to do that. So we should be able to help you achieve any of these goals today through what we're going to share. Here's me again. I don't think you can see me shared on the screen, so there I am again, in case you forgot what I looked like. And like Robin kindly mentioned, some of my past experience, I run Heirloom, which is my own branding agency, do a lot of brand positioning and naming, which we'll talk about today. I also started a blog and a podcast called How Brands Are Built, and we'll provide some links to that because there's a lot of educational content on that site as well. Including the podcast. You can listen to interviews that I've done with branding experts. And previously, I did work at HP. I was their head of naming and brand architecture, but also some of the bigger agencies and some small agencies out there and around the world. So if you're in the branding community already, you may recognize some of these names. And I should also mention, while I'm talking about myself here briefly at the beginning, I'm an American. You can probably tell from my accent. So I wanted to apologize in advance. A lot of examples that I'll be giving today are probably very American or at least Western. And there's not too much I can do about that. I've worked in Asia, like Robin said, so maybe I'll be able to speak about that a little bit. But I now live in the US and most of my work experience is here. Also, like I said, I've done a lot of strategy and naming. So while this will really cover everything about branding, there will be maybe a little bit more of a focus on those things. I'm not a designer. I'm not a logo designer or an identity designer. So while I will talk about those things, that comes less from my own personal experience doing that kind of work and more from my general branding expertise and experience working with people who are great at those different areas. So we're going to start at the beginning, and this really is an intro to branding course. So if you already know a lot about branding, then this is going to be a refresher for you. What is brand? We'll start there. I said we're going to start with definitions, so let's start with the most basic one. But then we'll get into some maybe deeper questions. Why do we want to build a strong brand? What makes a brand strong? I don't know if you've thought about that, but what does that even mean? And then how do we do it? And the majority of the day will be more on that fourth question of how we do it. So what is a brand? My definition here is the ideas behind, identity of, and experiences created by an organization, product, service, or other entity. So the end of that is just saying a brand can be a company, it can be a product, a service, sometimes it's something else, a sports team, a celebrity. But the beginning part is also really important. So the ideas behind that brand, that's really the strategy. What is it all about? Who is it for? Why does it matter? The identity of course, that's about the visual identity, but really a lot more than that, which we'll talk about. And then experiences created by that brand as well. And if you've ever thought about the definition of brand, you know that there are just about as many definitions as there are people working in the industry. So I wanted to put a few other famous definitions up here, one from Interbrand, one from Marty Neumeier, who you may have heard of, who's written books like The Brand Gap. And all of these definitions are fine. Some people take more of an analytical perspective. Marty Neumeier really tries to simplify it and make it more about the customer. So my definition, I hope, really captures kind of everything that I think is important about brand and what's really going to be useful to you as someone trying to build brands. So why do we want to build a strong brand? I think there are a number of reasons. For you, if you own that brand, then you want to increase demand, loyalty, and advocacy. At least, those are three metrics that brand can help on performance. Price premiums. So you've probably seen infographics or sort of memes like you pay so much more for a cup of coffee from Starbucks than you would from just the shop around the corner. A lot of that has to do with the brand. And then stability. So COVID-19 is a good example of this. Lots of businesses have gone under. Some of the ones that won't are those with the strongest brands. It has helped them in some way survive because people are still willing to pay that price premium even at times like this. It's also useful for customers. Hopefully, if people are building brands well, then they're paying attention to what their customers have to say. And so they're creating more useful offerings, more useful products. It makes it easier for customers to find what they're looking for. So if you know you like Coke versus Pepsi, you recognize that red bottle or can in the grocery store, it's easier for you to find it. So that's another purpose of brands. And then also self-expression. A lot of this may be subconscious sometimes, but a lot of times the reason we buy a brand is because of what it says about us. We want to have the MacBook because we want, when we're working in the coffee shop, we want people to see that Apple logo in front of us instead of some other brand because we feel it says something about who we are. It's also really important for employees. So people, there's a lot of research around this, but people who work for more well-respected brands have higher job satisfaction. There's likely to be lower turnover. You're less likely to quit when you're upset. If you really believe in that brand and what it stands for, then maybe you'll stick it out longer, give it another shot. And maybe you'll be more engaged as an employee. You'll be more excited about what's going on at the company, and that will pay quite a few dividends in terms of productivity for the business over the long term. And then lastly, I think brands are important for the community as well, potentially. Again, sort of like I said, for customers, if the brand is paying attention to what people want, then they may be innovating in a way that's relevant for the whole community, the whole world, creating products that the world needs. And also a lot of brands provide support for causes of some sort. And we'll talk about that, but a good example is Red, Project Red, which has partnered with everyone from Apple to North Face to create mostly red products that give to HIV and AIDS research. Okay, so what makes a brand strong? A lot of this is debatable, of course, but most experts agree the strongest brands are authentic. They are true to who they are. They do what they say they'll do. They're built around a really clear idea. They have a well-crafted vision and they're focused on a single idea. We'll talk about that more. There's some degree of consistency. So they're not changing who they are on a daily basis. So across time, but also across touch points. So when you get, let's take Virgin, for example. They have lots of different businesses. When you fly on Virgin Atlantic or Virgin Air, you'll have an experience, and then you'll expect to have a very similar experience when you fly one of the airlines somewhere else in the world. Differentiation. Most people believe that brands need to have some degree of distinctiveness, that they stand apart from their competition, that there's something unique about them, whether that's in their underlying ethos, who they are, or just in how they look. And then emotionally powerful. Strong brands connect with people. There's something deeper than just we make things that work really well. A lot of brands also have some emotional potency to them. Okay, and a lot of how we build strong brands then is brand strategy. And that's the first topic that we want to talk about. So again, a definition, an articulation of the ideas upon which a brand is built, and the plan for systematically expressing those ideas through identity and experiences. So you see how that connects back to the definition of brand. And then there's a process. And this is just a really simplified, generalized process that we're going to use as our guiding kind of tool throughout most of this presentation. So you have to immerse yourself in some way. Some people call that the discovery phase, where you're learning about the brand or the competition. You then define the strategy. That's writing a brand strategy platform. Then you're going to express that, obviously through logo design, but lots and lots of other ways as well, hopefully. And then you're going to implement that brand once it's out in the world, once it's been launched. And that's really a cyclical process that goes on hopefully forever, or for as long as the brand lives. And then sometimes you may even go back all the way to the beginning of this process. If you're doing a rebrand, say, you might need to then go back and redefine the strategy, redesign the brand, and so on. So let's start with immersion. What is that and how does it work? A really important tool here, a really simple tool, is what I call the 3 C's. The C's are company, or the brand that you're working on behalf of. Sometimes it's not a company. Client could be another C there. Competitors and customers. And in each of those circles, we have something we want to learn. So in the company, we want to learn what's true about the company, why does it exist, what's its purpose. From competitors, you want to learn about what makes it unique, what do we do better or differently. And for customers, we're hoping to learn, what do they want, what makes us relevant or appealing. Is there some need that they have that no other brand has met that we might be able to meet in order to stand out in the marketplace? And the way that we're going to learn that during our immersion phase, there's a million different ways we could go about learning those and asking those questions. So I've just put a few up here. Everything from looking at the business strategy or doing interviews on the inside of the brand, to a competitor brand audit, maybe going to stores. If you're working for a coffee shop, you'll go to the other coffee shops and see how they're doing things. And then learning from customers can be anything from quantitative surveys, if you have hundreds of customers or more, to just sitting down one-on-one with a handful of customers if you're just starting a small business. And once you have all those things, there was this triangle that represented the intersection of those three circles. If you can find something that meets requirements in each of those three circles, then you'll have a brand or a brand essence, which we'll talk about in a minute, that is authentic, differentiating, and emotionally powerful, which were three of the things that we said make really strong brands. And it's really hard to find something that meets all three of those criteria, but that is one of the core goals of doing a brand strategy exercise. So just a couple of quick samples here. And I should have mentioned earlier, a lot of these slides are going to be shared with you after the session today. So don't feel like you have to scramble and take notes or screenshot every single slide. About 90% of these slides will be available to you in a PDF. So I'm not going to dwell on slides like this with a lot of text, but I did just want to give an example. Here are some of the questions you might ask when you sit down with a client, say, or with the leadership at a company, and ask what the brand is all about, and try to start learning how the brand works and how it can maybe stand out in the marketplace. Also for customers or consumers, just a screenshot here of something done for Dolby. This is not my work, but just something I found online. These are the types of consumer personas that you might create. So who are these people? What do they care about? Specifically for Dolby, which does a lot of business in sound. How do they think about music? What do they listen to? How do they like to listen to music or other audio? And so you start to get to know these customers and start to group them, sort of stereotype them, and say, okay, we have people like Tim the escapist or Megan the entertainer. And then you start to understand how you can build a brand that's really relevant to those people. And then lastly, looking at competitors, this is just an example of trying to pack a lot into one slide about how you might learn about a competitive brand. So when I worked for JD Power, which Robin mentioned, a competitor was Nielsen, and we wanted to look at what they were saying about their brand. So you see some key messages there in the middle towards the bottom, just copied from their website and other marketing materials, some imagery, iconography, but also kind of an assessment of what they stand for or what they're trying to stand for. So that real consumer data, insights into what's next. At the top, that was our kind of extrapolation or assessment of here's what we think they're all about, sort of their positioning or their brand strategy as best we could assess it. So once you've done that kind of immersion, it's time to figure out what the intersection of those three things is. How can we be differentiating, true to ourselves, or authentic, and also relevant or emotionally powerful in some way for consumers or customers? And then we define a strategy. So I mentioned this before, what is a brand strategy? But important to note that there are really two main ways to document it. So typically you'll see someone do something like a brand platform on the left. We'll talk about that first. And then also potentially something more like a brand narrative on the right. And we'll talk about that as well. So brand platform. If you look around online, or maybe you've already worked with some things like this, there are a bunch of models and frameworks like what you see here. And seeing them on a slide like this, hopefully you feel the same as I do. It's a little scary. It's a lot to look at. It's kind of confusing and daunting. And so we're going to try to simplify this. I've looked at each of these and probably some others and worked with quite a few of them. And generally speaking, they have kind of the same ingredients, even though they all look a little bit different. And here they are. So there are plenty of models out there, but most of them have these same key ingredients. The brand essence, which I mentioned briefly, and you can see kind of an explanation there of what it is. We'll get into more detail. Moving left to right across the top, the vision or the values of the organization. And then a description, that should say description of customers. I should add this here. So the 4 on the left are about the brand, and the 2 on the right are about the target or the customer. So then on the bottom, we have a brand personality, sometimes just some basic capabilities, like you could call them brand pillars or strengths of the brand. Just trying to sum that up is a really good practice when you're doing brand strategy work. And then some insight about the customers. Who are they? What do they care about? What do they want? What's driving them? What motivates them? Sometimes you'll also see other components in different models. You'll see things specifically about what makes us unique, or what are our functional and emotional benefits. And those are all great things to include as well, but I'm just trying to simplify here a little bit. So let's talk about brand essence first, since it's kind of the core at the middle of a lot of these brand platforms. So it's that core idea, or sometimes it's called a proposition or purpose or rallying cry. The definition, it's a succinct articulation, meaning usually 3, 5, 6 words of the core idea or ideas around which a brand is built. So the idea here, and kind of a central premise of brand strategy, is that there's real power in standing for a single clear idea, something really focused, and saying this is what our brand is all about. And it's usually something abstract. So for Nike, for example, which we'll talk about first, and I'll mention a few times because it's such a great brand, it's not shoes. I mean, yeah, that's what they make, but it's something a little more kind of higher end and abstract than that. So Nike really stands for victory, which, if you know that Nike is the goddess of victory, it kind of makes a lot of sense. And since they work with sports and athletes, of course, they want to have people feel like they'll win if they wear their shoes or their products. But really, all of these famous brands, you could kind of sum up in a word. And we could debate, are these the right words? I don't know how familiar all of these brands are, but by and large, because these are such strong brands, most people will say, if you ask them, what does IBM stand for? They'll say something about smart or brains or computing power or something like that. And so they've done a good job over the years, over the decades, of building a really focused idea of what they're all about. And I mentioned Nike, so here's just a quote that I love from Steve Jobs. And if you have the chance, you can look up a video of him presenting the Think Different campaign back in the 80s, I think. And he says this, that Nike sells a commodity, they sell shoes. But when you think of Nike, you feel something different than a shoe company. And they build their brand up quite a bit through ads, but they don't ever talk about the product. They don't even show you the shoes. And they certainly don't say, our air soles are better than our competitors' air soles. What do? They honor great athletes and they honor great athletics. That's who they are. That's what they are about. And I've used this quote with clients and said, if this is what Nike does, if they're honoring this type of person and this type of thing, then what is your brand all about? What do you believe in? What inspires you? What type of people are you trying to inspire? And that's a really good way of thinking about what your brand is all about. Here are some real world examples of brand essences. They generally are not just a single word. Usually strategists feel the need to say a little bit more, 3 or 4 words maybe. And so we have everything over here from Zune, which was a failed product for Microsoft trying to beat the iPod, to AT&T on the bottom, relentless innovation for human progress. That's pretty dated. I'm sure that they may be using something else now. Ford, feel the difference. And then a company called Sappi on the right, inspired to innovate, powered to lead. Sometimes you see those kind of two-phrase setups for an essence. A lot of times they look like taglines, which is okay. They're different. They're not the same thing as taglines. They're really intended more for internal use. But they sometimes sort of feel that way. They should be emotionally powerful, ideally. And so that's why you see a similarity between them and taglines. Okay. Positioning, probably something you've heard about if you've read anything about brand strategy. So this is kind of how we find that brand essence, how we figure out whether we're on the right track with our essence idea. And it's the act of defining a brand position, which is the conceptual territory claimed by a brand relative to other brands. That's really important. You can't position in a vacuum. You have to have brands that you're competing against, so that you can figure out what position you want to try to own in a marketplace. And so generally what you'll see is some kind of spectrum, and you'll take an industry and you'll say, on this line, how do all the other brands stack up? And so one way of doing that, this is just one of really infinite examples, is from a tangible or rational end of the spectrum to a more intangible or emotional. And there are some kind of points along this line. So you could position your brand around what we have, our infrastructure, what we do, how we do it, who we are, or all the way up to why we do it, the most intangible or emotionally based type of positioning. What is the cause that we stand for? And, you know, Steve Jobs said Nike sells a commodity. Let's take something even more commoditized. Let's just talk about water, just bottled water. You know, unless you believe their claims, it's the same thing in each of these in each of these bottles, right? Pretty much the same thing. And yet you still see this broad spectrum of how these brands are positioned. So the brand on the left comes from a store called Costco. That Kirkland brand that they sell there, they use that brand for everything from water to tires to clothes to just about anything that they sell in the store. It's just it's called a private label brand when a store has its own brand. But the brand doesn't stand for anything product centric. All it means is that it comes from this company that has a massive infrastructure and is able to drive prices down really low and get you pretty good quality for low prices. So when you see that brand, all it's telling you is that that water is going to be a good value because you know it comes from that company. Then you take a brand like Crystal Geyser, which is just a water brand, and then it's about what we do. You know, we do water really well, and that's all we do. We make really good water, hopefully. And so that's a different way to position. Smart Water, they talk a lot about how they do it. You know, according to them, their water is special because of the process that it goes through, because of I don't know, electrolytes or something that they add to it. I'm not even sure what their claims are, but you know, just by saying in the name that it's smart water implies that it's different from the water in all of these other bottles. A brand like Voss, I think it's really all about kind of personality and attitude. The bottle design is very different. It sort of looks high end. You see this, or at least you used to see this in clubs a lot, where they're trying to make it look kind of sexy and cool, even though it's just a bottle of water. And then on the right-hand side, a brand that Starbucks has invested in or maybe purchased called Ethos, which is one of these brands where every time you buy a bottle of water from them, they'll give water to somebody in need, sort of like Tom's Shoes or a lot of these other brands. And so that's a brand where the whole idea of it is they're not even really saying our water is especially good. They're just saying, buy our water because we'll give somebody else water when you do, and that makes you feel good, and it's a good thing to do. So even just with water, you can see this vast spectrum. And if, for example, there was a missing spot on this spectrum, then you might say to yourself, if you were creating your own bottled water brand, maybe that's a spot that we can own. Often, though, you'll see not just one axis like this, but two. And you get this 2x2, which is one of the more kind of famous and popular tools used by brand strategists. So here I want to show another example of positioning, a great one from the early 2000s. If you think about the gaming industry, the game console industry, going back to the 80s, you have this kind of spectrum here. So the midline now has changed. It's from hyper realistic graphics to cartoon-ish graphics. And then vertically, we have games for groups or families versus games for individual gamers, people that are really there to game and play it by themselves. They're not there to sort of have fun at a family party. And in 1983, at least in the US, Nintendo kind of came onto the scene and made a big splash with the original classic Nintendo Entertainment System. And that was, pretty bad graphics. I mean, even back in the 80s, it looked like a cartoon with Super Mario Brothers. And it was kind of in the middle there. You could play it by yourself, but it was also really a fun family activity to have. Came with 2 controllers usually, and you could play with your sibling or your friend. About 7 years later, they came out with Super Nintendo, and the main difference there was the graphics got a little better, and so you see that shifted over to the left a little bit. And then things started to get a little more competitive. Nintendo came out with their GameCube, which I don't really even remember, in about 2000. But the bigger news in that time frame was that Sony came out with PlayStation 2, and Xbox from Microsoft came out. And all of a sudden, these things are really shifting over to the left here, where the graphics started to get really good. And the games started to be a little more intense and more, especially with PlayStation and Xbox, aimed at people who wanted to really identify as gamers. And so it wasn't about playing with the family, it was about sitting down and competing in a game. And that trend just kind of continued. In 2005 and 6, PlayStation 3 came out, Xbox 360 came out, and the graphics started getting really, really good. But this is where we get into positioning. So competition in the console market was primarily based on technology performance. Companies attracted buyers by offering faster graphics processors, better physics engines, chip innovation, and hardware tweaks. What did Nintendo do when they saw that everyone was shifting further and further to the left here? And frankly, I imagine they may not have even been able to compete with these hyper-realistic graphics. They went up here and they launched the Wii. So Nintendo realized that for many people, the gaming fun factor wasn't necessarily tied to hardware performance. Making the gaming experience easy and fun was a way to enhance customer value. And so the Wii was born. And this comes from a case study of Nintendo Wii. So they really maxed out on games being about playing with your family, standing up, getting physical, having fun at a party. And also, they didn't care about the graphics. The Wii graphics are like cartoons. They're silly looking. There's not anything realistic about them in a lot of their games. And so that is a classic example of positioning yourself, finding an open space, and succeeding by creating something that, frankly, nobody else was trying to create, as opposed to just trying to continue competing with PlayStation and Xbox 360. So that's a really successful way to use brand strategy to figure out what product to create and succeed in the marketplace. Okay, moving back to our different ingredients in a brand platform, brand personality. It's a set of human personality traits ascribed to a brand, another thing that's really useful sometimes. Some industries really define the look, they really differentiate along brand personality alone. So Uber and Lyft, for example, especially when they first launched, really the only difference between them was their look and feel, which was defined by personality. So Uber was very sleek. They had black cars. There's a lot of black and white and silver looking in their brand. There's something sort of serious about the way they make themselves look. Lyft took the opposite tack. They went with pink and purple and blue. They had pink mustaches on the front of the cars at first, although those became problematic as they got really dirty, and so they stopped doing it. But still, their brand was all about kind of fun, a little bit silly, and that was how they differentiated. Just a real world example here so you can see how strategists create a brand personality. This is a pretty simple way of doing it, but it's often just sort of a set of adjectives. So this is for Associated Press, the news organization, AP, and they define themselves as gutsy, resourceful, and connected. And you can see it's hard to read, but they don't just use the word, they explain it a little bit more, both with the image and with the text, to say this is what we mean when we say we are gutsy, resourceful, and connected. So we're not going to go into any more of these in detail, but just to show you some real world examples, all of these ingredients together are often put together into a brand platform, or sometimes what's called a brand on a page, and it might look like this. This is from a university called Tulane in the United States, and you can see a purpose at the top, a strategy, and some pillars. And then another example here of a brand platform from something called Proofpoint, but this is multiple pages. They had the platform there on the left, and you can see their little framework all the way on the left. But then they list out their pillars and describe each one in detail, their promise, which is sort of like a essence or positioning statement, and then their personality traits as well. So we're about halfway through. I'd love to take a quick little break. I think Designhill has something they want to share. I'm going to take a look and see. I can't see the questions while I'm presenting if people are typing them in. So I'm going to take a look and see what people have been asking or saying, and see if I can respond to a couple of those while I hand it back over to Robin, who I think wants to play a quick video for you.
All right, guys. I'm loving this presentation, Rob. You are seriously sharing some great insights about branding and with real and everyday examples. And from the chat section also, we can see that our amazing audience is loving this too. Thank you so much, Rob, for these valuable insights. And before we move forward, I would like to give a quick shout out to Designhill for organizing this event.
Claremax is a full-service video agency. Production. We created a brand that fit our identity at the time, but as we've evolved as a company, we found that original brand didn't quite fit our aspirations anymore. Finding a partner to rebrand your entire company takes a lot of time and effort. Finding Designhill was an incredible lifeline. Designhill offers a money-back guarantee. If we don't like any of the designs, we get all of our money back. The stuff that we ended up with were well beyond what we had been seeing on other creative services platforms. After creating a simple design brief by answering some questions created by Designhill, we posted, and within a few days, we had over 250 entries. Designhill's platform made it easy to communicate with all of the potential designers. Eventually, we picked a winner. In addition to a logo, our designer also created a letterhead, business cards, and banners for all of our social media platforms. With Designhill's help, we now have a brand that meets our aspirations. We're ready for the future and everything that it's here to bring. Made it easy to communicate with all of the potential designers. Eventually, we picked a winner. In addition to a logo, our designer also created a letterhead, business cards, and banners for all of our social media platforms. With design.
All right, guys, we are back again, and let's continue with the session. Rob, over to you.
Great. So we left off talking about brand platforms as one way of documenting a brand strategy. The other way I mentioned earlier is a brand narrative. So narrative just meaning a written statement of some sort. So basically we take all the ingredients of that brand platform and you can kind of rearrange them into what's sometimes called a positioning statement, a brand narrative. I've called it a manifesto. All of these terms in branding, some people may distinguish between them. I mentioned earlier positioning or a promise statement, like we saw one of them using. Generally speaking, there are only so many different ways to do things, and so you can either distinguish between them or not. But I'm just kind of using narrative or positioning statement as interchangeably here as a way of referring to this written out way of expressing the brand. If you look online about how to write one of these, you'll get a bunch of strong opinions from people saying that there's only one right way to do this and you have to include this, this, and this. And a lot of times they look like a fill in the blank, or what's you see in the middle there, what's called Mad Libs, where you just pick a noun, pick an adjective, pick a verb. And these work fine. Marty Neumeyer has a famous one of these that he calls his onlyness statement. These work fine, and it's a really good exercise for forcing yourself to simplify and just pick one or two words that represent who is your brand for, What category is it in? What makes it unique? And just getting those basic answers down on paper, which is a lot of what brand strategy is about, especially if you're working with a large team and you need to try to get everyone to agree instead of everyone having a different opinion. But I just want to really quickly say that in practice, having worked on the consultancy side as a brand strategist, we would never hand a client something this kind of simple or basic and say, this is your positioning statement. Maybe if it was for one of 100 products that the company sells and you just needed something quick and simple. But if it's for the whole company and the organization, generally speaking, these brand narratives are much longer, much more detailed, and much more sort of emotionally powerful than just a sentence could ever be. And so just one example here, I know the text is really small. It's from the I Love New York brand. So I'm sure you know this brand, at least from the logo, the famous logo by, I think it's Massimo Vignelli, unless I'm misremembering right now. I think that's not right. the famous logo that I'm sure you recognize. But there's a manifesto behind this, or at least there was at one time, and it's all about New York City. And it's really written more like a poem almost, or an ad. It reads like an ad that you might see in a magazine. And so I'm not going to read the whole thing, but it's got things in it that start to give the reader a feel for what it's like to be in New York City. Reminders of being on the elevator in the Empire State Building, seeing cherries grow on trees on Fifth Avenue, and different things about really all of New York State. I think it's not just New York City. And so when you read something like this, it's more than just that kind of really specific, how is New York different from other cities, and who is it for, and what's the core idea behind it. That should all be included in this, but it's also really trying to give you a more well-rounded feel for what this brand is all about. And even though I said it's like an ad, remember, this is really for internal use. This is to presumably to tell designers what should they make design work look like. And so by reading this first before you sit down to maybe create an illustration on behalf of the I Love New York brand, you will get yourself into the right headspace of, this is what this brand is all about. I can feel it in my bones, and I'm ready to sit down and start doing work that is really representative and expressive of that I Love New York brand. So I won't show other examples, but that's just to give you an idea of what that looks like. But we need to move on to some other topics. So far, we've really just talked about brand strategy, brand positioning, and there's a lot more to branding, and this course is really trying to cover everything. And so we're going to move quickly through a bunch of other areas of what branding is all about. So brand architecture. It's how a set of brands relate to one another. So this only applies if you're working with a brand that has more than one product, or it's a family of brands that are all related to each other somehow. And there's a couple of key aspects here. How do we choose to structure our portfolio? So for example, you may have heard branded house or house of brands. I'll tell you a little bit more about what that means in a minute. How do we group our brands, and what's the hierarchy between them? So Viacom, for example, is a company that owns a bunch of TV channels. And generally speaking, they organize those by viewer life stage. So they own Nickelodeon for kids. They own, I think, MTV, which is more for teenagers. They own other channels that are more for middle-aged people, and so on. And then really key is determining through brand architecture whether different brands are going to share any visual or verbal elements. So classic example here is the Marriott hotel brand. They have a sub-brand called Courtyard by Marriott, and so they chose to put by Marriott in that name to signal that it's part of the Marriott family. But then they also own the Ritz-Carlton brand, very high-end, which they acquired. And I think they wisely chose not to put the Marriott name next to Ritz-Carlton because it might have devalued the Ritz-Carlton brand. Other things to know about brand architecture. What are we trying to do with brand architecture? So we want to help customers find brands more easily and kind of influence how they search and select within a big portfolio of brands. And we also want to manage how they attribute their experiences, either positive or negative, to different brands within a portfolio. So Marriott, again, if they have a terrible stay at Courtyard by Marriott, unfortunately, that probably means it'll lower their perception or damage their perception of Marriott overall. Whereas if that same thing happens, they may still have a really high opinion of Ritz-Carlton because, frankly, they may not know that Ritz-Carlton is owned by Marriott. Or at the very least, it doesn't feel as connected to Marriott because it's not in the name. So I know a lot of this may be confusing or may not make sense in the abstract, so we'll show some examples here. If you've ever heard of brand architecture, then you've probably seen something like this. So I mentioned branded house and house of brands. On the left is what's called a branded house. This is a bit out of date here. That's the old Google logo. But especially before Google created Alphabet, it was very much a branded house. Everything under Google was branded. Everything in the house was branded as Google, from Google Books to Google Maps and so on. Whereas Procter & Gamble and lots of other consumer packaged goods companies from centuries ago, in some cases, were really more house of brands. So inside the house, there are many, many brands, from Tide laundry detergent to Folgers coffee to Pampers diapers, and they all look totally different, and you would have no way of knowing that they're connected unless you maybe read the fine print on the product and see that Procter & Gamble is the company behind all of them. And then in practice, most brands are a hybrid, just meaning they're somewhere in between. And Coca-Cola is a good example of this. That's the company is the Coca-Cola company. It's also their most famous beverage, Coke. But then they own a bunch of other drinks and products, food and beverage products, from Sprite to different juices and things like that. They're acquiring things all the time, and they don't rebrand them all to Coca-Cola for, I think, obvious reasons. So that's called a hybrid brand architecture. The truth is, though, there's quite a bit more underneath that, which we're not going to have time to get into, but just figuring out all of the details of, all the different versions of Coke, for example, Diet Coke, Coke Zero. How do you name those? How do you figure out which ones to create and whether they should look a lot like each other or just a little bit like each other? Those are all brand architecture questions. Another just way of showing kind of a goal of brand architecture, especially when you have a branded house, when you're using the same brand over and over again, like Apple does, is that you're building brand equity. So on the left here, looking at how high these different lines are, that's supposed to represent how much equity these brands have, meaning how popular they are, for lack of a better phrase. And on the right here, we're moving over time. So depending on how old you are, you may remember the original iPod. And that became quite popular quite quickly. And that's the iPod Classic there. But then they came out with the Mini and the Shuffle and the Touch. And each of these products had kind of a short, relatively speaking, a short lifespan. They became really popular. Everybody got one. Then the next one came out and nobody wanted the old one anymore. And so you see them kind of rise and fall over time. But the iPod brand, which spanned all of those, the Classic, the Mini, the Shuffle, it lasted longer and it had more brand equity. So whenever a new iPod came out, no matter what it was called, people were excited about it. But eventually the iPod brand pretty much died off as well. It's still out there, I think, but increasingly hard to get because, of course, the iPhone came out and had most of the same capabilities plus a whole lot more. And so again, the original came out, then 3, 4, 5, 6, now we're up to X something. And each one, again, it rises and falls. And I'm sure you guys have this same experience, whether it's with Apple or Samsung or any other phone company, that the new one comes out and everybody kind of wants that, and the old one is less popular all of a sudden. But the iPhone brand is still riding really high. Every time a new iPhone comes out, people get excited and get in lines around the block. And what's really incredible is that over this, the Apple brand is part of iPod and iPhone, and now the watch and AirPods and everything else that they're doing, not to mention MacBook and MacBook Pro. And so its brand, along with its stock price, frankly, has continued to just increase and increase over time as they continue to have successful products even though those products don't last as long or anywhere near as long as the actual Apple brand. And so that's something that brand architecture can do for you. If you label all your products as being from that same brand and each of those products is a success, then you'll start to build brand equity for the master brand or the parent brand. I've used a couple of these terms already and just want to quickly make sure you're familiar with them. Master brand or parent brand or corporate brand. So I'm using all Microsoft examples here. I said sub-brand earlier. That's really kind of a loose way of referring to any brand that falls underneath that parent brand. Microsoft Dynamics. Ingredient brand, I haven't talked about, but that is, kind of what it sounds like, a brand that fits inside of another product or brand to give it a little bit something special. So Windows Azure is a brand that shows up kind of like AWS from Amazon. And when you see that something is running on Azure or AWS, it tells you something about the quality of that offering. Bing, really interestingly here, and speaking of brand architecture, this slide is a little bit old. Bing was originally an independent brand. It did not say that it had anything to do with Microsoft, even though most of us knew that it did. It was presented as just a separate thing, as was Xbox originally. But very recently, I think in the past 6 months, Microsoft decided to rename it. And now if you go to bing.com, you'll see that it's Microsoft Bing. So they have folded that in underneath the parent brand. And because of the last slide I showed with Apple, you know what that does for them. It means that if people have a great experience with Bing, they will think more of the Microsoft brand. An endorsed brand is a brand that has a little line underneath it that says something like a Microsoft company. This is very common for acquired companies, which Maluba is one of those. So, and sometimes this represents just a short time period, which I'll show on the next slide, that it would say a Microsoft company. Maybe eventually it will be Microsoft Maluba. Maybe it already is, and I just haven't noticed it yet. And then lastly, co-branding, which is when you take two separate brands, so in this case, two totally separate organizations, Microsoft and Adobe, and they partner on something to bring something to customers. I can't honestly remember what it was that Microsoft and Adobe did together, but a great example of this is Nike and iPod, when they came out with shoes that had a chip in them that would connect to your iPod and put music to the pace that you were running at. Last slide on brand architecture here. I mentioned that sometimes sometimes there's a time element to brand architecture. So when brands are acquired or merge into an existing equity or architecture, it can often be done something like this. So the top example, this is one of my examples that I'm sorry, may be very US centric. So if you're not in the US, you may not be familiar with it. Kinko's was a copy center, where you went to get photocopies and print things. It was acquired by FedEx about a decade or 15 years ago. It became FedEx Kinko's. So they didn't want to just get rid of the Kinko's brand because it was very popular. But that represented just a point in time. I think maybe it was 2 years that it was FedEx Kinko's before they just got rid of the Kinko's brand and became FedEx Office. And there's a little ad that you can see there in between where they, of course, had to say FedEx Kinko's is now FedEx Office. And so that's a way of migrating. That's called a migration path. It's a way of migrating one brand into another. Sometimes it's done a little bit differently. So when AT&T and Singular merged in 2006-ish, they chose to keep the AT&T brand, but they rebranded, they recreated that logo to a more kind of modern look. And then the clunkiest way of doing this is when Kraft and Heinz merged, and it doesn't matter as much because it's a behind the scenes company. It's a B2B company that's really more for investors than customers. But they just shoved the two names together, and that's the least sort of elegant solution here, but it's one way of just combining two brands. So let's talk about verbal identity. And so we're now in the expression part. We're definitely going to talk about visual. And I know Designhill focuses a lot on visual and logo design. So I do want to make sure we cover that, but let's start with verbal, meaning the words that we use to express a brand. So there are three parts to this: voice, messaging, and naming. We'll talk about voice and messaging first. Really quickly, messaging is what we say, and voice is how we say it. So If we want to say hello, that's the message that we're sending. But of course, there are many different ways of saying that. Even if you're using English, you could say good day, you could say ahoy, you could say howdy. And this is kind of a silly example, but if you go to a website and the brand and it says howdy right on the front of the page, that gives you a very different sense of what that brand is going to be like to deal with than if it says something really formal like good afternoon. And so that's what voice is all about. And just one example of a voice in guidelines from a brand called Schoolhouse Electric. They just write out kind of, again, adjectives, sort of like brand personality, and a statement here about what they sound like. And so they can give this to people who are going to write on their behalf, whether it's an ad or web copy, to make sure that the voice sounds right. Here's an example of how you might create a voice framework in your brand guidelines or in something that you're presenting to a client. You might have a character, so kind of like those little Lego guys. You might say, we want to sound like, a formal British butler, because that's what our brand, it's very kind of uptight and formal. And so you can kind of write about that character. You can have principles, so kind of big ideas, big buckets of ideas of how we want to sound. And then eventually you want to get into specific writing tactics. How do we do that? Maybe we have short sentences, or we use this word instead of this word. We never use abbreviations or contractions. And you get into this level of detail that really explains to writers sort of the do's and don'ts of writing in the voice for that brand. Here's how a brand essence, which we talked about earlier, can influence messaging for a brand like Nike. So if that essence, again, is victory, or it says spirit of victory here, you might have these messaging themes. Perform at your best, you, the athlete, are the hero, and we, Nike, are innovating for athletes. And then that's going to translate into everything that's written on behalf of the brand. So here for Nike, we have everything from a print ad to their annual report. And I know the text is small here, but everything that they write has this sense of, it's the voice and it's also the message. We're on offense. Everything you need is already inside. No excuses. We obliterate boundaries. That's in their careers page on their website. So even on the careers page of their website, they're delivering this consistent message in a relatively consistent voice. And so here, I showed this for messaging. Here's how you might do something similar for voice. You might have an overarching messaging theme, 3-ish, it doesn't have to be 3, but 3 to 5 supporting themes. What are the things that we talk about as a brand? And then here, instead of writing tactics, you want to have some proof points. So if we say that we as a brand, or that we innovate for athletes like Nike does, well, what's your proof? What are the products that you've come out with? How many scientists do you have on your staff that are constantly researching better ways to make shoes? All of those proof points would then go into your messaging to make everything that you say about yourselves more believable. Naming. So one of my favorite recent brands, this is a CBD carbonated beverage called Recess, which I think is a great one-word way of capturing kind of the relaxation and fun that they're hoping to express through their brand identity. So when we talk about naming, one of the easiest and frankly most fun places to start is with naming pitfalls or mistakes. Unfortunately, a lot of brands make mistakes when they name themselves. So a famous one is the World Wrestling Federation, which became known as WWF, was in about a decade-long lawsuit with the World Wildlife Foundation on the left, also WWF. And so presumably because they didn't think hard about the name and whether or not they were going to get sued, they came up with this name that was identical to another brand on the market. And what happened was 12 years later, and after 12 years-ish of lawsuits, they rebranded as WWE. Small change, but enough, I suppose, to satisfy the lawyers. But presumably, a really expensive rebrand and something that they didn't want to do. Another kind of famous naming pitfall is the linguistic or cultural disaster. So Reebok in the 90s, I think, came out with a shoe called Incubus, and they had to recall the shoe. This is a major naming mistake. They I think must have lost a lot of money, and it was kind of embarrassing because it turns out that incubus, I won't bother to read it, hopefully you can see it, has a pretty offensive meaning. And the people who knew that meaning were offended that this shoe had that name, and so they made a lot of noise, and Reebok had to recall the shoe and rename it. And then more recently, this is not involving language so much as just something called cultural appropriation. Kim Kardashian wanted to name her brand Kimono. A lot of Japanese people and Japanese Americans were offended by the use of that word because they felt that she was borrowing something from Japanese culture that didn't belong to her and trying to make a profit off of it. And so she renamed to Skims. Quite clever. You'll see that both names contain her name, Kim, in the beginning of Kimono and in the middle of Skims. So she found a workaround, and luckily it was kind of before she really had launched or invested a lot of money, but still it was a bit of a black mark on her reputation that she had to then deal with, that she might not have had to deal with had she gone through a more rigorous naming process that would have identified this problem before she announced it on Instagram. So what makes a great brand name? Sort of like we talked about with brands, lots of different opinions here, but generally speaking, strong brand names are rooted in strategy, easy to remember, adaptable. They can grow with the brand over time. And as we just showed on the last two slides, they're legally available and linguistically viable. One thing just to think about here, there are lots of different types of brand names. So everything from really abstract names that have nothing to do with what the company does. Apple is one of those, but so is Virgin, Google, for the most part, down to really descriptive names like vitamin water. It's water with vitamins in it. And then also what's called the construct, the type of word that you're using. So real words like, again, Apple, Virgin, Amazon, Twitter, those are real, in this case, English words. Compounds, which are two real words shoved together. Fitbit is another one of these. And then coined, which is really a catch-all for any kind of word that is made up or misspelled or something like that. So Kodak, completely made up word that has nothing, that means nothing, and therefore is also abstract. The founder liked it because of those K's on the beginning and the end. He felt made it sound very strong and powerful. There are some other types of names that kind of aren't captured here. A lot of brands are just named after a person, especially if you go back in history. You'll find plenty of brands like Ford that I mentioned earlier, just named after the founder. Alphanumerics or acronyms or initialisms are kind of confusing. IBM, for example, if you know that that stands for International Business Machines, then you will say that it's a very descriptive name. If you had no idea that that's what IBM stood for, then it's just a meaningless series of letters, and you would think of it as more of an abstract brand. And then also, I said most of these real words here are English, but of course, lots of brands, especially around the world, are non-English words. But even in your local language, you may encounter brands that are in a foreign language. And so that may be meaningful to you, or it may not, depending on whether or not you speak that language. But that's another kind of approach to naming that's not captured here. I mentioned a rigorous naming process. So here it is, and we don't have time to kind of go into detail, but you will notice that that middle step is where you do your screening and you make sure that you're not stepping on somebody else's trademark like WWF, that you're not hopefully doing something that is culturally or linguistically offensive in another language where you're going to be doing business. So you do all that before you even present your name ideas to your client or to your company, so that you make sure you're not coming up with ideas that are going to be problematic. Okay, moving right along. I know I'm picking up the pace here, but I'm conscious of time and want to make sure we have time for some Q&A at the end. So there are different types of logos, iconic symbols, word marks on the right, so just a word as a logo, and then the combination of those two. But let's not limit ourselves to logos. One of the main things I can leave you with visual identity is to think of it as more than just a logo. So this is my agency, but on the logos on the left, you also have a color palette that's going to affect not only the logo, but everything else that the brand does. You have a typography style that is hopefully somewhat unique to your brand. And then you have imagery, illustration, photo style, and many other elements that can form a visual identity system. And each of these is really critical. And I'll show that here. Color by itself is enough to identify some brands. So I'm not sure how familiar you are with these, but that is, of course, Google in the upper left, which you can pretty much tell just by that rainbow color palette. UPS on the upper right is famous for its brown trucks. Virgin was or is famous for the kind of purple lighting in the cabins of its airplanes. And Tiffany's has its own blue, Tiffany blue, that their packaging always uses. And so even just with color alone, you can build a strong brand identity. Typography. Even when you see the Coca-Cola brand in another language, that style of writing is so identifiable that you recognize that as the Chinese name for Coca-Cola. This is when I teach this in person, I like to make this a quiz. Unfortunately, I can't do that with you guys, but hopefully some of these pop out at you. That's Disney in the upper right. That is from the new Facebook logo in the lower left. That's the ACEB in the middle of the word Facebook. And then that stop, I've shown this brand a few times. It's not a proprietary font. It's a font that anybody can use, but that is how Nike writes in a lot of their ads, with that all caps, very bold. I believe it's Futura. And then patterns, photography, illustration. So again, some of these may be familiar to you. The 3 stripes there on the ceiling of that store, that's Adidas, the 3 stripes brand. The Wall Street Journal in the upper right uses that illustration style that you see there for James Bond. Luxury brands like Goyard and Louis Vuitton love to use these proprietary patterns, so you recognize their bags and products even when you don't see the logo anywhere, and so on. What makes a great logo? This is where, I'm stepping out of my comfort zone a little bit because I'm not a designer, but it's easy to find examples of logos that everybody thinks are great, pretty much everyone in the branding community, and a lot of them are here. So everything from Girl Scouts to Westinghouse, classic ones, UPS, which I've mentioned. You see a bunch of examples here, and I think even if you're not a designer, you can look at this and start to get a sense of what's similar about all of these logos. What's amazing about all of these logos, and the reason I've chosen them, is that there are probably over 100 on this slide, and all of them come from just 5 different sources. So the ones in the upper left are by a very famous designer named Saul Bass. In the upper right are by probably the other most famous logo designer, Paul Rand. You have a couple of agencies here too, Shermayeff and Geismar in the middle on the top, and then Landor and Pentagram, which are 2 of the most famous identity design firms, have done the ones in the lower left and the lower right. So what is it that they're all doing consistently? Again, it's subjective, but most people would say great logos are simple, memorable, adaptable, rooted in the strategy. So there's some kind of message in that logo. It's not just a pretty picture, and timeless. Which I think is really important about all the logos I just showed. They're not following some cool logo trend. There aren't a lot of swooshes or gradients in a lot of these because they want to look as good 10, 50, maybe even 100 years from now as they did when they were created. And my favorite quote about logo design that kind of sums this all up is from Shermayeff, now passed away designer. It's usually a 2-month process, but it should look like it took 5 minutes. And so if you go back to some of these logos, these are the logos that people say, oh, my kid could have done that. Or, I could draw that on a napkin in a second. How could that possibly be a $100,000 logo? Well, again, it should look that simple, but if you've ever done logo design work, you know that it's not simple to get a client to agree to something that is that simple. So I'll end here with just a couple of thoughts on implementation and management. Beyond visual identity, I want to make sure that you all think about other types of brand experience. Sonic identity, olfactory, or the smell of a brand. Packages and shapes. Coca-Cola actually owns a trademark on the shape of their bottle. iPhone's packaging is unique. Events, causes, endorsements or sponsorships, the employee experience, and UI or interactions. The final strategy usually goes into brand guidelines, which you've probably heard of. So some examples of those, and just a list here, which will be in the file that we send out of what's usually included in those guidelines. And then lastly, a few other things to think about if you're managing a brand. Employee brand adoption, brand extensions. I won't read them all because I know we're kind of out of time here, but a bunch of other ideas for you to consider if you're in charge of managing a brand. So thank you guys very much for your time. Thank you to Designhill. We're getting close to the end of the time. I hope you guys can stay and we can do a little bit of Q&A.
All right. So Rob, that was an awesome presentation and I seriously loved that. And you shared some valuable insights to the audience. Now let's jump to the Q&A. So you can, Rob, you can go to the questions tab. First, let's take the question which has maximum number of upvotes. So I can see this question. It's number 3 from the top by Isha. She's asking about brand strategy. I'm not able to see the question. I think there's a problem with my internet. Can you please read out? It's number 3 from the top. Yeah. So Isha is asking, a lot of startups are not sure about investing in strategy and they prefer having just a simple logo design to start with. Right. How can we educate some upcoming brands about such strategy and its importance?
Yeah, it's a great question. And there are so many services now, including Designhill, where people can get relatively cost-effective logo designs that are great, you know, or at the very least that will work well for them in the startup phase. And so I know that a lot of startup founders, they're trying to move quickly. They don't have the funding maybe to invest in a really large strategy phase. And so I think we have to be flexible as strategists and not try to force them into something that's frankly too much for them. The typical way of answering this question, which I think is right, is that, you know, if you're going to design a logo on their behalf, you're going to start asking them some questions, some really basic questions like, well, what do you want it to look like? What do you want people to think when they see the logo? And if you find that they don't know how to answer those questions, then that is brand strategy, you know, figuring out the answers to those questions. And so sometimes you might even just think of it as the brief for the logo. And so if you kind of couch it in that conversation so that you're not saying it's our strategy phase and it's going to take 6 weeks and it's going to cost tens of thousands of dollars, but you're just saying the first step of the logo phase is to answer these questions about your brand. You don't even have to say the word strategy. It's just your logo brief, but it is strategy if you're forcing them to think about the right answers to these questions. Maybe if there's a bunch of startup founders, for them all to be on the same page. And sometimes you'll end up selling them strategy. You know, they'll say, you know what, we tried to answer these questions and we realized that we just don't agree on what this brand is all about. Then that's your opportunity to say, okay, well, let's spend you know, a little bit of time and money figuring out the answers, and that's what brand strategy is. Honestly, if they know the answers and they're super confident, you don't have to force it. You can just say, okay, it feels like you guys know what you're all about. You know, we haven't validated it, unfortunately. You know, you haven't done the work to validate that with customers or do a bunch of research looking at competitors. But if they want to pull the trigger on logo design, or I would say full visual identity system, then you can probably go ahead and do that, and just encourage them to revisit it when they have the time and the funding to think more strategically about maybe rebranding in a few years.
Okay, that sounds good. And I hope, Isha, that answers your question. And thank you so much, Rob, for answering this. Let's take the next question. It's from Carolina. She's asking about advertisements. She's asking, do you believe advertisements have a lot of influence nowadays? If yes, in what way? And should also like to know if you think ads will be relevant in the future.
Yeah, I think ads will always be relevant in some way, shape, or form. I do think that, you know, you may be thinking of TV commercials and ads in the newspaper or magazines, I think they have clearly lost some relevance with the rise of digital advertising. And I think another, and mobile advertising and everything else, in-game advertising, whatever you want to talk about. There are so many different types of ads, and some things that you might not even identify as ads, but really are. Not to mention, I'm sure you're getting tons of ads on Instagram and things like that. So I think they're all relevant. I do think that in some cases they are less an expression of the brand, and they are more a really pragmatic tool to drive awareness, salience, and get some clicks and eyeballs on a website or something like that, which is then a greater opportunity to serve as an expression of the brand. So I'm thinking of Google ads, for example. You don't have an opportunity to design them in a lot of cases if they're text ads, and you don't have a lot of space to write. So it's less about, what is this brand all about? And it's more about, frankly, just catching people's attention and getting them to click. So I think there's maybe a shift in the degree to which there are really brand touch points. But I definitely think they're still relevant. Those more kind of old school approaches to ads, I think are also still relevant, but yeah, have probably diminished somewhat, and maybe will continue to diminish in the future.
Okay, that sounds good. And I hope, Carolina, this answers your question. And we have another question from Carolina, and it has 10 upvotes. She's asking, what did you study to become part of branding industry? I think she's asking, like, did you do any specialization, or
Right.
was it your part of your degree about branding?
No, I'm happy to answer that. So my background is maybe unique. I studied psychology. I did not have any intention of going into business at all, much less branding, but have found that an understanding of human psychology has been pretty useful. And just, having an interest in how people think and how they make decisions has been useful. But I think, there isn't much of a kind of prescribed track for education towards becoming a brand strategist or branding person. You can get an MBA, but you don't have to. If you're a designer, you can get an MFA or study design. And I do think most designers need to have some kind of training, whether that's from a university or just from watching a bunch of YouTube videos and practicing for years to really get experience. But that's my background. A lot of my training is on the job at agencies. And I do think that starting out at a small agency where you'll be able to do more and you'll get a lot of exposure to more senior people is a great way to learn on the job. And I would encourage you to try that. Beyond that, there are plenty of resources online. And, we mentioned How Brands Are Built, my podcast, but beyond the podcast, there's a website, and I make available a bunch of lists of podcasts to listen to, courses to take, books to read. And so I'm always happy to share ideas like that. Unfortunately, I think it's not enough to just read all those books and call yourself a brand strategist. You have to get some experience and maybe a little bit of education from a sort of more person-to-person interaction as well.
Okay, that's awesome. And talking about books only, Mary is asking, Rob, do you recommend any book study material about branding?
Yeah, and I have the list on the site, and I think Designhill or Robin will provide a link here. If you go to resources on How Brands Are Built, you'll find the book list. But I would recommend a really classic book from the 80s called Positioning by Al Reese and Jack Trout. It's super old now. I heard that they're coming out with a redo of the book with more modern examples, which would be great. But all of the ideas in there still apply. They're these sort of universal ideas, many of which I've shared today. Some more recent books, there's How Brands Grow is a much more kind of scientific look at branding, but I think it's good if you want to become more well-rounded. Marty Neumeyer writes some really fun books like Brand Gap and Zag, and David Ocker also has written some kind of classic tomes on brand strategy. They're a little hard to get through sometimes, but there's useful information in them. So that's a short list, but there are much longer lists on the website.
Okay. I hope you guys are keeping a note of the books that is recommended by Rob. And Rob, let's take the next question. It's from Ian. He's asking about the testing that is used in brand development. So he's asking what is the best way to learn more about the approach and data recording of different types of testing used in brand development. What information should be captured, etc.
I'm just reading the question again, types of testing used. So it really depends on the phase, I think. I usually kind of think of research I oversimplify probably into two different types of research. There's input on the front end of a project where you're just trying to learn. And that's really that immersion phase that I mentioned earlier. And it depends on the project. But it could be anything from a quantitative study with customers where you're launching one of these surveys and asking them a dozen questions, and then working with a data analyst to figure out what those responses mean and what they're telling you, to something much less formal, like sitting down with 3 prospective customers. And this is, if it's a startup idea that you have and the company doesn't even exist yet, the product doesn't exist, but you just want to get a feel for what people might like, could be sitting down with a few of your friends and running the idea by them and getting a feel for whether you have a good idea or not. There are all kinds of other things you can do. Some of them were listed on that earlier slide. The other kind of research is what I call validation, and that happens more towards the end of a project. So if you're about to launch a logo or a name, or if you have a product that's been in the market for a while, you might do some testing to see how it's doing. Another thing, it was on a slide, but I didn't really have time to mention it, is brand tracking. And that may be, that may be more what you're talking about. So typically that's a quantitative survey that you're putting out into the field regularly, every 6 months, every year, where you're asking questions about awareness, preference, just net promoter score, how likely are you to recommend our brand to one of your friends? Some of these classic questions. I think almost more important than the questions you're asking is asking them consistently and seeing the trends over time, so that you can tell whether your brand is doing better or worse than it was a year ago, and hopefully why. So those are some of the different kinds of research that you might do and some of the methodologies you might use.
Okay, that sounds cool. And I hope, Jan, this answers your query. And let's take next question from Jacobs, and it has 5 upvotes. He's asking, as a brand designer, should you aim for an industry specifically, sports for example, or can I work for different industries? What would be the best choice?
Yeah, I would encourage you to be a generalist. So if you want to specialize, I would specialize in a type of design almost before specializing in an industry. So you might be a logo designer, for example, or you might be an illustrator or a photographer, or you might specialize in typography, or if you're a logo designer, maybe you specialize in sort of a certain type of logo. I don't know, monograms, word marks. You don't have to do that, but if you're going to specialize, I would encourage you to do something more on that side than saying I'm only going to do design work for a specific industry. Just because I think the principles are universal. A great logo for a sports team would likely be a great logo for a B2B corporation, potentially. I mean, I do think sports, it's interesting that you chose that one because there are some unique sort of elements to like sports mascot and logo design. And I have seen some designers that seem to specialize in that industry. So it's not to say you can't do it, but generally speaking, I wouldn't limit yourself. You might specialize in it, and that you're really interested in sports and you really enjoy doing that kind of work, but it shouldn't stop you from doing work in other industries. And I would encourage you to at least try to get some exposure to other industries, because I think a lot of the great things that happen in design come from that kind of unexpected cross-pollination between industries. A great corporate logo that kind of looks like a football team's logo could be really interesting. Whereas another sports logo that looks like every other sports team's logo, it just gets kind of boring after a while.
Okay. I hope, Ian, this answers your question. And we have another question from Ian. He's asking about mentorship. He's asking, are there any branding mentorship programs outside of regular employment? I would like to get more of a hands-on experience with the guidance of an industry professional so I can learn the real world ropes. I think he's asking about the mentorship because I also believe that having a mentor is really good, and it eases your learning process. So do you would like to say anything about this?
Yeah, it's a great question. Unfortunately, I don't think I have a great answer for it. I happen to be familiar with one maybe relevant example that I can speak to. So Jacob Cass, who runs Just Creative in Sydney, Australia, I'll put in a little plug for him. I know he's done events with Designhill as well. He's a designer, but he runs a coaching program that you can apply to get into. It's called Inner Triangle, and you get one-on-one calls with him or group calls with him and sort of build a relationship with him. I don't think it's free, but it's something that you could look into. It's probably more geared towards designers and probably more geared towards freelance designers, since that's effectively what Jacob is. But things like that exist. So if that's not the right fit for you, I would encourage you to look into coaching programs and things like that. Beyond that, I mentor someone, but it's one-on-one, and it's just somebody that I know that reached out to me personally, and it's someone I had worked with before, so we already had a relationship. So you might also look for something like that, someone that or someone that you've heard of and really respect and want to reach out to directly. I think opportunities like that exist, and it's kind of interesting during COVID. You may find that people are more receptive to it because we're all trying to build relationships through screens like this right now. So now might actually be a good time to reach out to somebody.
Okay, great. So we are really short by time, guys. Let's take the last two questions for the day. It's from Kyle. He's asking, how do you convey the importance of a brand beyond just a logo to a prospective client?
Okay. Hopefully some of the slides in the deck that I just shared will speak to that. It depends on what's going to persuade your client, but there is research out there about correlations between brand strength and just business performance, whether that's revenues or profitability or price premiums or stock price. And so you could find some articles or research papers if you think that's going to be persuasive. I think sometimes anecdotes are better than data, though. Talk to them about their own lives. Chances are they bought an Apple product or an expensive cup of coffee versus a cheap cup of coffee, or an expensive bottled water versus the cheap thing. Ask them why they did that. We're all, back to human psychology, we're all kind of subject to these same universal principles of kind of bias, and we're easily persuaded whether we like to think we are or not. We're irrational creatures. Another great book, it's not exactly branding related, but books about behavioral economics, like Predictably Irrational by Dan Ariely, or Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman, talk a lot about just how the brain works. And fact is that we make decisions based on emotion. We make decisions very quickly without thinking carefully a lot of times. And that's what brands take advantage of, frankly. And so, you know, there's a lot of evidence out there, and you just got to find the right way in that conversation to make them feel it and make them aware of it. I think a lot of it is context dependent, you know, knowing your audience and what's going to convince them.
Okay.
Hopefully that helps a little bit.
Hope I'll just answer the question. Let's take the last question for today. It's from Isha. She's giving reference of two brands, I guess. She's asking, in terms of screening and checks, Heineken and Meyerson both have a red star logo. How do these two brands coexist with similar symbols? Do you have any idea about this, Rob?
Brand I'm just reading the questions. Yeah, so great question. Actually, there's something, not to plug How Brands Are Built again, but if you go to that blog right now, howbrandsarebuilt.com, the first article that you'll see is about trademarks, and this is a trademark question. I'm not a lawyer, so I can't give legal advice. I have to say that, but this one I can answer. So Heineken and Macy's, luckily, for this purpose, are completely different industries with basically no overlap. Macy's does not sell beer. Heineken does not sell clothes or furniture or anything like that. And so their trademarks are probably registered with specific, what are called industry classes. Heineken is registered that star trademark, likely, in the beverages category, and even more specifically to beer, goods, and services, whereas Macy's has their trademark registered probably in a bunch of different classes in goods and services, since they do a bunch of different things, but probably not beer. And so that allows them to each coexist even with identical logos. What it really comes down to, or one of the main principles here, is customer confusion. And if you think about it, if you're just a reasonable, well-educated consumer, you're pretty unlikely to see the Heineken bottle and mistakenly think that that's Macy's beer. And you're pretty unlikely to walk into a Macy's store and see that star logo and be actually confused and think you're shopping at a Heineken store. And so that's why, you know, the people who manage these things, lawyers, judges, whoever, allow those two things to coexist because they're not afraid that consumers are going to mistake them. In other cases, you know, if Macy's did come out with Macy's beer, that might be risky for them. It might upset Heineken. It might actually confuse customers. And so then there would be the potential for there to be a trademark issue. And so that's, you know, whether it's a name or a logo, that's where you start to get into potential trademark infringement. And yeah, there's plenty about that on the blog and in some of the podcast episodes. And I'm happy to answer any other questions you have if you want to get in touch.
Okay. And thank you so much, Rob, for answering all the questions. And guys, this brings us to the end of this wonderful session. This was indeed a value-packed session. I hope you guys loved this session. And once again, I would like to thank Rob for taking out time to be part of this event.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks to Designhill, and thanks to everyone for all the great questions and participation. I hope you'll stay in touch and get in touch if you'd like to.
And so guys, we have one more exciting update for you guys. So if you would like to hear more about Rob, about branding, on 26th of January, that is upcoming Tuesday, he would be discussing about branding topics with other brand strategists and designers from all around the world. So join in or listen to this big brand debate on Jan 26 at 8 a.m. Central European Time. Rashmi from our team would be sharing the link in the chat section, so you can check out that. And also you can check out the resources, articles that Rob has created. These are really great, and I hope this will help you in branding. So, all right. This is not where it ends, guys. We have a lot more events lined up for you in coming days. The next event is a panel discussion on videos goes social, successful video marketing strategies for the brands. The link is in the chat section. So if you guys are interested and haven't registered yet, I am putting the link of our event section in the chat section where you can find all of our upcoming events and register. And to stay updated with events like these, you can follow us on our LinkedIn page. You can also give suggestions of the topic you would like us to cover and speakers you want us to host. I'm dropping the link of our LinkedIn page in our chat section here. And to watch this session and other such wonderful events, subscribe to our event section on designhill.com/events or visit our official YouTube channel, Designhill. You can find the link in the chat section. And for all the business owners who are listening to this and wish to source high quality graphic designs and build their brand today, visit designhill.com. Also, we have recently launched a DIY creative tool called Designhill Studio. Be it a designer or a non-designer, everyone can create beautiful designs such as business collaterals, presentations, social media posts, banners, and much more within a few minutes and all by themselves. To check it out, you can visit designhill.com/studio. On that note, I would like to say bye to everyone who joined us here today. Take care, guys, and stay safe.